Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're so happy to have Andrea here with us for this great topic. We're talking about good grief, supporting the grief of young children. And we're going to start our webinar in just one moment. I just wanted to run through a few things with you, a few housekeeping items that come from the Canadian Child Care Federation. What I wanted to do is remind everybody that we are a national organization, which many of you may belong to us. We're hoping a lot of you belong to us. And those of you that don't, we would like you to reach out to your provincial or territorial affiliate organization because you can attain membership to the federation through your affiliate. And that's how we gain membership across the country. And we have affiliate organizations in all the provinces and territories pretty well, so from coast to coast to coast. And that is a great way to stay connected with the sector, with our profession, and all the great things that the Canadian Child Care Federation is doing. So before I pass it on to Andrea, I just wanted to add another thing, which I will talk about again at the end of the webinar, and it's about the certificates, because I know people are keen about their professional development certificates. So after the webinar, within 2 days after this webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance from the Canadian Child Care Federation with our logo on it. Please note that you will have to attend at least 50 minutes of the webinar in order to attain that certificate of attendance, and as well it's your responsibility at your end to ensure that that certificate is acceptable for professional development in your community because it varies from different community to different community. So it's impossible for us to tell you if it's actually going to count in your with your regulatory body. So that's something you need to do to figure out if it counts or not. So just to give you that little heads up. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea with no further ado. Welcome, Andrea. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. I actually just came from I was in a retirement residence for their holiday dinner. My mother recently moved there, and so I was with like a lot of 80s and 90-year-olds and then came to this. So I feel like I'm sort of spanning the age span right now. And this is really one of the topics I get the most excited about. I'm a registered nurse, I'm a grief therapist. And so for the last 25 years, actually probably almost 30 now, a lot of my work has been in helping families or professionals support kids of all ages who are grieving. And a lot of the work that I do is specific to when they're grieving a death that is happening or has happened in their lives. But I also know that grief isn't just specific to death, it is any significant loss. So, a lot of what I'll be talking about in this time together, you can apply those strategies for other losses that kids are experiencing and everything as well. But before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge where I'm coming from. So, I'm coming from Guelph, Ontario, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Mississauga, the Credit First Nations of the Anishinaabe people. And for many years, I was sort of like giving the acknowledgement of the land, but I realized I didn't know the stories. And more recently, I've sort of been doing a deeper dive into like, okay, what are the stories of the people who lived here long before my ancestors ever settled here? And that's going to be a big theme that I hope comes out in the next hour too. Is that if we look across the world throughout history, across cultures, stories are one of the ways that we really keep not just kids, but all of us connected to people who have died in our lives. And so, I think that's something that we really need to encourage, especially when we're working with, sometimes I find I'm working with like really young kids who might not even have memories of their person who died. I recently had a family that I work with, and it was Thanksgiving. And I find Thanksgiving often catches families off guard in terms of the intensity of the grief and the impact of that empty spot at the table. And everyone around the table was invited, to share memories of the person who died. But the person who died, their son, was only 2 when the parent died, and was really, really stumped. And what they figured out is actually if they just made a subtle change to the language and instead invited stories about dad instead of memories, he was able to participate. And that's where often when I'm working with young kids who might not have a lot of memories, I feel there's a bigger sort of role of the community to learn the stories and share the stories to keep them connected. Now, this website that I'm showing right now, as far as I can tell, unless I'm missing parts of it, I don't know that it necessarily does a deep dive into the stories of the land, but it certainly can tell you right across Turtle Island. Like you put in your address, it's going to tell you where you are, what the traditional languages are, what the territories are, what the treaties were, if there were treaties, the names of those treaties. So I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar as well. I'm going to send the slides out. So I've told Robin and Suzanne tomorrow you will get the slides. I may add a few more things depending on the discussion that comes up in the Q&A and stuff, but you will anything that you see in the slides, you do not need to write because they will be sent out to you. So I'm seeing in the chat, I love a few people are saying hello. Although I think everything's coming right through to us. I don't know if it's if you're all able to actually talk to each other right now. But either way, see if you can put to everyone because it would be lovely just to see who's here. Oh yeah, I think it's all coming through to hosts and panelists, which is fine too. I can see all the introductions. I'd love to know, and I'll just sort of like be eyeballing it, but in the chat where people are coming from. Like I just saw Rochelle's from Moose Jaw, amazing. Um, Introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from, and I'd love to, if you know the traditional territory that you're on, throw that in there. And but I'd love to know too if you're coming from, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of people are early childhood educators, but if you're coming, because you're a parent supporting a grieving child, or for some other reason, you're personally connected to a grieving child, and of course there could be overlap of the two. Please feel free to throw that in as well. And we'll also really keep an eye on that box for questions. So I'm going to try my best. It's always hard when it's a 1 hour webinar because once I start talking about children and grief, like I can go for hours and hours, but I recognize it's late for a lot of us. I'm going to try my best to sort of wrap it up by 8:45 Eastern time. So there's time for a good Q&A as
I can
well.
help you with the questions at the end too. So I'll turn my camera off, but I'm here and I can
Beautiful.
help look at the chat and see if I can fix that, see if they can share with everybody. And then I'll come back on at the end and we can do that together if you like.
Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you, Robin. Um, I love that in the midst of the hard lockdowns of the pandemic, there was like a full page spread that came out in the New York Times to this topic that is it's an overly academic name as far as I'm concerned. It's disenfranchised grief. But it's a really important concept. And it's speaking to grief that is often not acknowledged, and sometimes it's that the griever isn't actually acknowledged. And the reason I'm starting off with this today is because often when I'm teaching, I find that young kids are amongst our most disenfranchised grievers. Right? We often push them to the sidelines. It's so common for people to say they're too young, they won't understand. Right? So they get pushed to the sidelines really, really quickly. And that's why I'm incredibly excited. I was incredibly excited when, Robin and Suzanne and Canadian Virtual Hospice said, hey, do you want to do this webinar? Because I find that there is so much room for advocacy. We often undermine the ability of children to understand concepts related to death and dying. And I think of myself and I was a young nurse at this time. No, I wasn't even a nurse yet. I worked as a volunteer. No, it's my summer job. I'm not a nighttime. I'm a early morning person, so you may have to bear with me here a bit. But I was in my early 20s. I think it was my summer job, and I was working at a camp for kids with cancer. And I was on the day camp team. And so day camp was like the 3 to 5 year olds. So I'm guessing that's, a lot of you are working with sort of those age ranges. And what we would do is to introduce them, even though it was day camp, to introduce them to the idea of overnight camp. They would do one sleepover night. And so I'm like in a tent one night with the 3 to 5 year olds. And just me, I'm the only adult. And just coincidentally, like most of them had siblings who had died. And so they were attending this camp for kids with cancer, but they were all surviving siblings. And as like they're going to sleep, like one of them's like, I know, why don't we tell the stories of when our siblings died? And I kind of went into my panic zone because I was like, oh my gosh, these are these kids' like first sleepover in a tent for pretty much all of them. And really internally, I was panicking because I was like, I don't think this is a really good idea to be like going to sleep with the stories of their siblings who died. But fortunately, there was something in me that knew just to hold back and shut up and keep my panic internal. Um, and I just listened. And I did a concept that I'm going to be sort of weaving throughout tonight, which is like I was bearing witness to them. I listened to their stories. And it was so profound for me to see these 5-year olds go around talking about like the day their sibling died and what happened and how they were involved or not involved or wish they were involved and all of these pieces. And it was really for me a incredible learning experience around the fact that like wow, like I completely underestimated that this could be a situation that could be okay and actually even helpful for them to share their stories with other young kids. And so, I've seen that. After that, I went into nursing as a pediatric oncology nurse, and so I had many experiences where sometimes young kids were even asking me if they were going to die. And eventually, I realized that my true passion was actually having these conversations. And so I now work as a grief therapist and with a team of grief therapists in Ontario. And most of my job is having these conversations now. And I can honestly say that I know more now than I did then when I was in that tent. And there's much more research in literature now. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into that tonight. I'm really going to break tonight out into a bit of, looking at what are some of the barriers, what holds us back, why do young kids tend to be such disenfranchised grievers? How do we recognize grief in kids? Because it often does get missed, unfortunately. There's some literature that's very clear as well, that when educators or parents are sort of like rating the distress or the grief of kids who are in their midst, we're often underestimating. And now that the research is going not so much to young kids like we're talking about tonight, but often to teens, there's more research where they're actually doing the studies with teens themselves who can self-report their distress. We're seeing that actually when kids are grieving, often their distress is higher than is externally visible to other people. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Just because a child is playing and having fun doesn't mean they're not grieving. And I'm going to focus on some support strategies. We'll have a Q&A. I've also got some resources that, some are woven in and many we might not actually have a chance to talk about, but they'll be at the end of the slides for when I get them all out to you. So I know some people are asking, I can see people asking if we're going to be able to access the recording. I don't actually know the answer to that, but we'll get Robin or Suzanne to maybe throw in an answer and I can speak it back out. And yes, there's no video for the attendees. Somebody's asking about that, but hopefully you're seeing me and hearing me right now. And again, I know I'm the only one who can actually see what you're putting in the chat, but I'd love to sort of put it out to all of you right now because I know that you have a lot of experience, many of you with children, young children. I want to know what are some of the barriers. If you found out that there was, for those of you who are educators, you found out there was a child coming to class and a parent had died over the weekend. What are some of the barriers? What are some of the worries that you would have about supporting this child? So, young child in daycare, your classroom, a parent has died over the weekend. You're told. I'll read out some of what I'm seeing. So, yeah, family not wanting to talk about it. Absolutely. Cultural expectations. What are their beliefs? What language are they using? All of those things. I'm seeing Robin saying, yes, the video replay will be available on the YouTube channel by the end of the week. Offending the beliefs of families, questions from other children. Absolutely. How much is being shared from family, wanting to respect that, not sharing too much, managing your own emotions about it. So important. That is so important in this work. We need to pay attention. And I'm going to encourage all of you to do that for yourselves tonight, too. Right? If I'm talking and things are getting stirred up for yourself, it might be, I always take that, it's like a tap on the shoulder. Like it might be that there's a personal experience you've had, whether it's supporting somebody else or your own lived experience, that might need some of your attention, right? So it's okay to step away. You might want to come back to the recording. But I do encourage, like, pay attention to that. If you're supporting a child in your class and you're like, wow, I'm surprised by the intensity of my response. take that as a tap on the shoulder. Pay attention to it. There might be some grief that you need to take care of as well. Yeah, how to tactfully navigate the situation. Lack of one-on-one time. We've got all of these kids, and they're going to be interrupting each other and things like that. Absolutely. Um, Emotions, yes. Barriers that have been seen, or school administrators not wanting the child's loss to be acknowledged, even if they talk about it themselves. Yes, and there's some really there are some good resources for schools, but I'll just sort of simplify it right now that the person saying this is right on the mark. We should be acknowledging it. If there's a death in the school community, it should be acknowledged, but we have to be skillful in terms of how we do it. Um, we lost a lot of staff unexpectedly. Someone sharing, I'm not going to say your names just in case you want any of this to be confidential. It was difficult to see it was difficult to know how to share with the staff, parents, and children as he was with us on Friday, but not back on Monday. Absolutely, that's so hard. How to keep it together yourself, how to support the parent, how to appropriately acknowledge and support conversations with students. Yes, and not wanting to cry myself, feeling settled within myself. All of these things I've heard from so many educators over the years. And, we're not going to go and do a deep dive today in terms of exactly what it can look like to go into the class and have conversations in all of those pieces. But I will say that you're all right on the mark in terms of like, we want to acknowledge it. There's ways to do it, even with young children. Some of what we contend with, I find some of the common misconceptions that often when I'm talking to parents, and usually I'm encouraging parents, and I would encourage any of those of you working in a professional capacity as educators, one of the first steps I would say is you want to have good communication with the parents, right? You want to acknowledge a few of the things that you just talked about as barriers, right? I always say to families right across the board who I'm working up with, I'm wondering if there's any cultural beliefs or traditions that would be helpful for me to know about as I support you or your child. I'm wondering if there's language you're using or that you're not using that I should know about, right? If there was a parent who died over the weekend and the child's coming back into school, we don't want 7 people contacting the parents and having the same conversation. We'd want to allocate one person to do so, administrator, or it might be an educator or somebody who's, particularly close to that family. But finding out from them, I'm wondering what your child's understanding of the situation is. And if you can find that out from the family before the child comes back to school, that can be really helpful. Right. And that's where sometimes we have to advocate too, because especially if it was an unexpected death, often we've got families being like, I don't have a clue what to do. And that's where I never want to over resource families in this situation. I'm not going to say, here's 17 websites and books you can read. Pick one or two, right? Here's some clear guidelines on talking to young kids. I'm including in the handouts, there's a great Dougie Center tip sheet. Dougie Center is like the gold standard of children grief centers in the United States. I love, there's one specifically on talking to preschoolers about death, right? Sesame Street researches the heck out of everything. And so one of the resources I believe I included, but if I didn't, I will certainly add it before I send the slides out. No, it is in there, is called When Families Grieve by Sesame Street. They use all the right language. I never trust Disney with things like talking about death and dying. They're going to throw some euphemisms in there, but Sesame Street will nail it. So with young children, the When Families Grieve YouTube video is one of my go-tos to also model for families so they can watch it with their kids to really model the language to use and everything else. And I will walk through some of those pieces. But often some of the barriers I'll get from families as well, like my child's not talking about it, then I'm not going to talk about what's going on. And this could apply as much to divorce or any other loss as well. And that's where I really advocate and I say, you know what? It's not a child's job to start the conversation when there's a big, hard thing going on in a family. Like that's an adult's job, right? For us to open the conversations. And then we want to take some guidance from the child on how much information they want. Kids have very different informational needs. But really, as adults, we need to start the conversation. And ideally, I want that happening at home. When I use the language of parents, I'm really speaking to anybody who's raising a child. So this might be foster dad, this might be grandma. When I speak to family, I'm talking about chosen family. right? A lot of people really worry and it's like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what language to use, right? And that's why it's great that there's some good resources around that now. And that's where, I often will say to people, you know what, you're better off talking with kids and just telling them if you don't know the answer, right? Or one of the best things we can do with kids is create an environment where they know they can ask all their questions. There are no bad questions. But we don't have to be able to answer those. Right? Sometimes we might be like, oh, I don't know the answer. Maybe your mom does, or maybe the oncologist does, or the homicide detective does. Would you like me to try to find that out? But sometimes kids are wondering about the same existential stuff we are, right? And we might not have an answer. We're just going to wonder with them. And in fact, as a professional, we have to be very careful that we're not putting our beliefs on children, is a really important one as well. I find for a lot of parents, though, where some of those barriers come up is they feel like I want to protect my child. And that gets translated into like, so I'm going to withhold information from my child. And what I really like to do for families is reframe that and empower them that, in fact, the best protection is preparation. And we have this large body of research these days that show that kids benefit from inclusion and honest information. Right? When somebody's dying in a child's life, I would never want to force a child to the bedside, but I remember when I was a nurse in palliative care, a grandparent was dying, and the family wanted to bring the grandkids in, and one of the elder nurses was there and like, don't do it, it's going to traumatize the kids. There is no research that proves that. And in fact, that we know that, if a child wanted to be there as grandma was dying, but we prevented them from what they imagine is going to be far worse than what the reality is. When we don't give kids information, they fill in the blanks, right? Themselves with their imagination. And I could write a book. I won't go into it tonight, but I could write a book one day of all the things kids told me about how they feel responsible for the death or the illness that happened in their life, right? Or how they think it looked, often envisioning things that they're seeing in their video games and on TV. But another common thing that I think often holds families back from entering into these conversations, is particularly if somebody is dying in a child's life, is this fear that, kids are going to think about it all the time. And that's where I find one of the things that we can all do as professionals who work with kids is help educate families about the fact that, in fact, kids grieve in chunks. Right. And that's in the short term where you tell a 4-year-old that maybe it's even just a sudden death that's happened in an accident, of a parent or a sibling. And they might be devastated. And then, like 7 minutes later, be like, can I go watch my show? And that often freaks out adults, but it's completely natural and healthy, right? Kids have short emotional attention spans, especially for intense feelings. When they're in it, it's huge, but then they jump out. Right. And I often find that they do, a much better job of sort of juggling joy and sorrow than we do as adults. This picture for me is a powerful depiction. This was a group of kids I worked with in Sri Lanka, Eastern Sri Lanka, right after the tsunami, like probably less than a month after the tsunami that hit in 2004. And really, like that was a level of devastation I'd never experienced, even as a nurse. And I was working, these kids were in an orphanage that had been built right up on the water. And unfortunately, when that tsunami hit, only about 30 out of 130 kids survived. And yet this is the picture, and I had permission to share it, of what the kids looked like some of the times, even despite that level of devastation and trauma and loss. They'd be running around and playing, and for sure I wasn't taking pictures of kids who were like, in the midst of grief bursts and things like that. But they would really fluctuate back and forth, which in a way that can often eclipse us as adults and our ability to do. And I find when adults understand that a child knowing about an impending death or a death that has happened is not going to derail their entire childhood, they will still play and have fun. That will often help a lot of adults enter into these conversations where they'd otherwise be hesitant to. And that's where I talk a lot about grief bursts. And grief bursts are completely natural, even for us as adults. It could be years after someone dies. And We see someone who reminds us of them, or smells a powerful elicitor of memory. But boom, there's a grief burst. I had a youth very recently who I was working with, and she was at school when the song that reminded her so much of her person who died came on. And it's been a few years since her person died, but boom, there was a grief burst, and she went off to the bathroom to, be away from the class, didn't want to cry in front of everybody. But that's the language we use, and it's the most natural thing ever. And this is where, in terms of a language, I mean, I know for her, this is a loving relationship. So I did use the language like your grief is rooted in your love. But often when I'm working with a group of kids, like I might not know if it's a loving relationship, right? It might have been a very difficult relationship. It might have been a very complicated relationship. Actually, one of the resources I'll add, a wonderful colleague on my team, Amy, recently wrote a book specifically for young children where somebody died in their life who they had a complicated relationship with. Right. And that's where we want to be careful. I never just say loved one and make that assumption. I think that this is a great quote that also just does a beautiful job of summarizing how kids grieve. Right, this is Julie Stokes, who had founded Winston's Wish. So this is sort of the gold star organized children's grief organization, I'd say, like in the UK. Anything you find on Winston's Wish website or the Dougie Center in the States is going to be phenomenal. Lighthouse program in Canada has amazing school resources as well. But I love this quote: for adults, grief is like wading through this enormous river, whereas for children, it's puddle jumping. But when they're in that puddle, it's no different to the river. So I'm going to ask, because again, I know you all know children really well, and I'll just read it out, but throw into the chat. So, what has it looked like, whether it's your own children, whether it's children you've been working with, when a child has been grieving? How has it shown itself? Most kids aren't going to verbally capture and express their grief. Some will, some are very emotionally literate. But many, it's going to come out in their behavior. And I'd like to just know, yep. So, yeah, everyone's coming through right now. I know, no, you can't see each other's, but anger, anger, outburst, anger, explosion, burst of anger. Yes, right on. Big feelings. I never say misbehaving. I always just say like grief involves big behaviors: crying, clinging, acting out, irritability, outbursts, sudden anger. Sometimes it's easier to be mad than sad, even for us as adults, right? I'm one of those adults who I got to work through some mad before I'm going to get to sad. Yeah, behavioral changes, acting differently, withdrawing, absolutely, angry, upset, crying. Um, some are really aggressive, quiet, withdrawal, scribbling instead of coloring like they used to, sleep changes, tummy changes, headaches, all of these things. Yeah, beautiful. I mean, you've all seen it. And this is where, if I'm working with a child and they've got all kinds of tummy aches and things like that, like I want to make sure I'm going to advocate that that family's getting it checked out at the doctor in case the child is constipated or something. And so we want to do due diligence, but we also know that grief can absolutely show up in our body, right? Need more hugs, attention, eating changes, all of those things, right? And so regression. So maybe a child hasn't been sucking their thumb for the last 2 years and now they are. Or maybe they start having, toilet accidents and things like that. I think of one family I worked with and a baby had died, and the 2 or 3 year old, it was a 3 year old, sort of regressed and started using a baby voice all the time and wanting to be held like a baby. Very hard for a parent who's also grieving the death of their baby, but that child going back to an earlier developmental stage that felt safer. And so difficulty concentrating is a big one as well. Death play. And this is where typically I find, especially like in daycare centers and with like young children in preschools and stuff, like you can see a lot I mean, play is a child's language, right? It's the safest world for them. And that's where quite often I find adults get worried, like, oh my gosh, is it going to scare other kids? Typically, it's scaring the adults more than other kids. But that's where, if a child was playing a lot of violent, really hard stuff and other kids were getting scared, what I'd want to do is compassionately, but like be working with their adults attached to them. They might need more spaces in their life to explore this, right? Like, not all kids necessarily need some one-on-one support, but this might be a kid who does and needs to do some play therapy or really have spaces. But quite often, when kids are playing out death, it's actually not upsetting the other kids. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into the research, but I certainly want this article to be on people's radars. It came out a few years ago. It's kind of my go-to. I mean, most of the families I'm working with as a grief therapist are, they're not like I want to read like a, multi-page literature search on the topic of children and grief. But I certainly do say to some of them, especially if I find that they're hesitant to maybe like engage in conversations or talk to their kids about what's going on, I might say, I'm wondering if you're the type of person who would actually like to know and benefit from knowing what the research on this topic actually says. I've got a super easy one-page article that I can send to you that's really what this New York Times article is doing is it was summarizing two pretty substantial literature searches, one entirely on worldwide on supporting kids who are dying themselves, and one on supporting kids who have a parent dying or with a life threatening illness. And essentially, the results of both of those lit searches came back that children would, and this is what I see day in and day out in my practice, but it's nice to know it's substantiated in the literature. Children benefit from honest information and inclusion. If someone's dying in their life, we want to let them know that. Right? And some of the tools and the resources that I'm sharing with you, certainly when you get these slides, we can really walk families through how to have those conversations as well. But for tonight's purposes, I want people to know just that it's, and the link to the New York Times article is actually in there. So when you get these slides, you'll be able to access that very. New York Times is a little tricky. I don't have a subscription. I can see like 2 articles a month and then I get cut off. But yeah, hopefully you'll at least be able to get in there. Um, so then when we're looking at like support strategies, okay, so how are we actually supporting kids and giving them tools to navigate grief? There's some of the proactive pieces that I find a lot of early childhood educators are really great at doing anyway, but it's like seizing that teachable moment. Right? I think if I was seeing a family recently and they were so impressed because there was a dead bird in the schoolyard and the preschool teacher, instead of rushing all the kids away, actually use it as a teachable moment to talk about the bird has died. The bird will never feel anything anymore. The bird's body won't feel anything anymore. Right? The bird will never fly again. Its heart is not beating. Right? So that's the teachable moment. Sometimes it's in literature, sometimes it's in movies. But really, when we're sometimes we're walking to school and there's a dead squirrel, and actually talking about the dead squirrel as opposed to just trying to get the kids by it. So that's a teachable moment. And I'm constantly encouraging people to seize the teachable moment. And then there's this piece. And again, I find a lot of classrooms are really, really good with this. I find we've gotten a lot better in the last 10 years, just fostering emotional literacy in the first place. Right? Like giving kids tools to be able to identify different feelings. I play Jenga and have turned it into a grief game, like with teenagers and with 3-year-olds. It's great. It crosses the age span too. And I play it where, you play a Jenga game and you pull out the block and, I read one of the feelings that are on there. And one time I felt this feeling and just giving kids sort of the tools to be able to name feelings. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Daniel Siegel and his work, The Whole Brain Child, and name it to tame it is his terminology. He wasn't speaking to grief in talking about name it to tame it, but it's so applicable to grief. And so often I'm trying to teach kids, about grief. What is this grief word? What does the word grief mean? And again, it's not just when there's a death, it's whenever we have a big loss. Right? And I find typically kids actually welcome, even the young kids welcome talking about grief and those teachable moments, the dead bird. Most kids are actually pretty into that. And again, it's adults who I find get quite anxious about it. But when I'm talking to kids about grief, I'm like, it's all the thoughts and feelings. Right? Certainly, as we get into older ages, I find, especially with teenagers, some are far more cerebral in their grief. So the feelings part might not resonate as much. But one of the things I'll often do is just create a brainstorm and about some of the feelings. When I'm doing one-on-one work with kids, I'll do a brainstorm of like the feelings that they are experiencing. So it's their grief brainstorm. But one of the things I always want to have, which is why I've highlighted on there, is the word happy, right? It's okay to be happy even when we're grieving. It doesn't mean we're happy that this has happened in this way, for in your family, but it's okay that you're happy even while this is happening, right? We can be happy and sad at the same time. And this is where I do find there's some myths in our society where people think talking to kids about death is going to be traumatizing for them. And certainly again, we don't want to push kids to the bedside or anything like that, but we want to invite them into these conversations. And most kids, and I hear this from educators all the time when they start bringing, sort of this into their classrooms, is that they're surprised by how welcoming of the conversation kids are. And, I think back to I was working with one family, and this preschool was super progressive. And so that we knew that dad was dying, and the little guy was 2, he was almost 3. And so they had me come in one evening and invited the parents in of all the other kids. And partially, we were able to attend to some of these pieces that I'm always encouraging, for educators to do with the parent of a child who is grieving, like develop a communication plan. But we were able to talk about it that, for this child, here's what his family's telling him. They're being very open, they're being honest. He knows dad's going to die. We're going to communicate out to everybody when this happens, right? We're encouraging you to use the words death and dying as opposed to lost. Kids lose things all the time, right? And then find them again. So when we use these euphemisms, passed away, very confusing and abstract for most kids, right? Even things like committed suicide. And I know, and it's, beyond sort of the time that we have for tonight to go into how we might talk to children, young children who have someone die in their life of suicide. But I can say that we absolutely don't want to ever use the language committed across the board. It's very stigmatizing. One of the resources that are in your slides when you get them is kidsgrief.ca. And it's a free website. There's a whole part of it for parents, a whole part for educators, and it walks parents through having conversations, including conversations about suicide. And the language we use there is that died by suicide, died from suicide. So it's very interchangeable, died from cancer, died from a car accident. So with this little guy who was almost 3 and dad's dying, they brought in the other parents. We were able to talk about this. We were able to do education on all of these pieces and everything else. They were able to ask their questions. They were able to express their worries. And it was so fascinating because when dad died, this little guy, and again, he wasn't 3 yet, he wanted to come back. He decided he wanted to come and tell the kids in circle time that his dad had died. And everybody was kind of like, really nervous about how this was going to go. And he did it. And I was so impressed with this childcare center because it was an incredible learning experience for them. And he said, my dad died on the weekend. He died of cancer. And they said it was fascinating. The kids asked some questions like, well, who's going to take care of you? My mom. Are you sad? Yes, I'm sad. Can we go play Lego? And that's kind of what happened. They all went and played Lego. The adults were all like, whoa. And this is where I know that this is a family that was like really proactive and like, yes, we're being inclusive and everything. And not all families are going to do that. But that's where this piece around the communication plan with the parents is really, really important, right? If you know that somebody's dying or a death has happened, trying to have, again, not 7 people, but one person at the child care center or in the school reaching out and really trying to figure out what language are they using, right? And, do they want resources around, sort of best practice for supporting kids when someone is dying in their life? So I want to make sure I just give everyone some tools too for like how we would actually talk about what the word died means, right? And this is regardless if it's the teachable moment and just the dead goldfish in the classroom, or if a child has somebody who's died. One of my favorite books, and I've included it in the handouts as well, is When Dinosaurs Die, and it's designed for sort of 4 to 7 or 8 year olds, but I use it younger and older. This language is right out of there. It's the same you'll see in Sesame Street when they're teaching Elmo about his uncle's death, right? It's a body has stopped working and it won't work again. It can't move, breathe, think, smell. but we want to be very specific, like it's the body. So, for those of us, like if we're not working in religious institutions and we're professionally supporting kids, we have to be very careful about not putting our beliefs on them in any way. And that's where, while we're really focusing on the physical, I also don't want to negate the belief system. I would never say to a child whose mom has died, your mom doesn't feel anything, your mom doesn't see anything, right? His mom's body doesn't feel anything anymore. And ideally, as professionals supporting, we've had conversations with parents before we're having these conversations with their kids. And this is, just sort of reiterating what I said earlier about like typically when I'm working with parents, I'm really encouraging them to open these conversations up, right? I could also write a book of all the ways even young kids have found out that there's somebody ill or who is dying or died in their life, right? Some kids are like little detectives. And that's where I'd always prefer that kids are finding out from the adults closest to them. And then, as professional supporters, if you have a child coming back and somebody's died, I really encourage acknowledging the situation, not out in front of everybody else. Young kids are typically more cool with that than older kids would be, but like I still try to be like, one on one and say, I'm really sad that your dad died on the weekend. I just want you to know, like, I'm here, I'm thinking of you. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about this, I'm here for you. Right? And most young kids pretty quickly are gonna be like, okay, and then go play. But you want to really acknowledge it and invite that they can come talk to you, they can ask their questions. Sometimes again with those questions, I'm like, that's a really good. Is it okay if I ask your mom about that? Right? What you might have seen as well when I talked, on this slide about the power of language. I know a lot of people get freaked out about the fact that sorry is on there. I don't want anyone thinking whether you've used a euphemism or whether you've said sorry, it does not mean that you've derailed kids or anything like that. Really the most important things for kids is that they've got safe, secure attachments and adults who are emotionally available to them. Right. So we have wiggle room if we've used language that's the opposite of what I'm, encouraging and things like that. But the one with sorry, I'll just quickly touch on, and it's 'cause a lot of young kids often misinterpret sorry like you've made a mistake, you've done something wrong, and they don't necessarily know how to respond to that. Right. Or I've had a lot of young kids when I'm like, I'm wondering what your understanding of your sibling's death is. Who was like, well, I know it was the doctor's fault because they said sorry that your brother died. So this, I love that the Dougie Center came out recently with this tip sheet, which again is in your slides, just about like alternatives to using sorry. But I often just say like, I've been thinking of you and your dad. I was really sad to hear that this happened. I want it on everyone's radar too. And these are great teaching points for parents. Right? And so don't assume that families are going to know. They might have gone through years of cancer treatment in a hospital and nobody's provided education about some of the common concerns kids have. So you want it on your radar. And if you can educate parents about it too, all the better. But a lot of kids, even young kids, worried that they've caused it. What is it called? It's so much better if I'm always encouraging parents, call it ALS, call it cancer. My daughter was 3 when my dad died from a very rare Parkinsonian illness called PSP. We barely knew what it was, but if we had just said, Papa is sick, Papa's sick, she has no way to differentiate that from all the other sicknesses that fly around daycare. Right? So we said, Papa had PSP. That's why he couldn't pick you up and hug you anymore. It made it so his arms weren't working properly anymore. And one of the biggest ones here that I really want to drive home is most kids, like the did I cause it? Can I catch it? I find I kind of like half the kids that I work with. I'd say almost every child I've worked with, and there have been many who have had a parent die, even if they have a healthy surviving parent, really this fear of abandonment and who is going to take care of me? What happens if something happens to my other parent? Very common concern. And that's where, again, for us as professional supporters, it's not always that it's our job or even our place to have that conversation, but we want to know that kids are often worried about that. When I mention that to parents, most of them are like, oh, yeah, my kids already asked me what's going to happen if I die too. Right? So, for us to be able to advocate and encourage parents to have conversations with their kids and let them know that they'll never be left to fend for themselves, right? And who their guardians are, if they've got those named, and, if not, it's an important thing for families to be thinking about. But this other piece is how will we stay connected? And I find sometimes kids, especially the little ones, again, are prematurely disconnected from somebody who's dying, right? So we might have to help find creative ways that they can be with their person and still connected. Maybe they're watching a movie together instead of playing hockey together and things like that. But a bigger piece of this is how do we keep them connected with their person after they die too, right? And that can be something like it's Mother's Day or Father's Day, and we should be talking about those in very inclusive ways in classrooms anyway, with no assumptions around, children's families. But if we know there's a child and maybe they're in a two-dad family, maybe mom has died, whatever the situation is, you can still make something for mom even though she's died, or you can make something for your surviving parent or somebody else, right? But if I ever hear a child say something like, I don't have a mom anymore, um, I will gently but firmly say, like, you do have a mom. Your mom doesn't stop being your mom because she died. She will always be your mom. And that's sort of that ongoing connection piece. And again, another piece to really just transmit to parents as well. So I'm going to close us out in just a second. I just want to sort of touch on a piece around many of you said this right off the bat that children's grief often shows up as big feelings. So I find a big piece with young children is helping them understand the difference between their feelings and behaviors. So you might have a child who is lashing out. I've got a number of young children right now who are kicking their surviving parent all the time, right? And that's where we're really working with them. Listen, you have every reason to feel mad or rage. It's absolutely okay. But the behavior of kicking your dad, the behavior is not okay. So we've got to find other safe ways to get big feelings out. And, this group of people probably has far more ideas than I can even come up with in terms of what that looks like. I will close us off with, one of the things that the more I do this work, I've really started emphasizing to people more about supporting kids is often people are like, how do I talk about death and dying? How do I explain grief? What do I say to acknowledge the death? But even to parents, I'm now saying, listen, like, in the end of the day, often the communication piece, the verbal communication is the easier part. The hardest part, and this is magnified for the parents of a grieving child, is often this act of bearing witness. So often we want to protect kids from the intensity of their emotions. And so we're quick to be like, oh, let's put on the movie, let's go get ice cream. And I really coach that whether we're professionally supporting, and I even have to remind myself of this as a grief therapist sometimes, or whether we're personally supporting our own children, that our job is not to fix grief. Grief is not a fix-it proposition. It's a natural and healthy, albeit very hard response to when we've had a significant loss. And what we actually want to do is just build up the child's ability to actually be with it. It might actually be that the child is devastated and crying and we're with them. And if you're a parent, you might be hugging them or an educator, depending if that's okay at your place or their age or whatever else. They might want extra affection and you're not trying to move them out of their grief or distract them from it. You're with them in it. I promise they will move out of it faster than you will. You let them be there. You let them be in that puddle. And in doing so, you're teaching them and building up their confidence that they can be with big feelings and emotions and survive them. And I think that's one of the most important gifts that we can give to kids. And then they're going to run off and play Lego and play with their friends. And you're probably going to have a whole bunch of your own grief that you're attending to. So I'm going to invite questions. I'm going to close us off with, key principles that I'm hoping have come out. Really, we want to be honest. We want to be inclusive. Unlike 20 years ago, we now have a large body of literature that really, even with young children, really, really supports that approach. We want to invite their questions, right? We want to help them understand what happened, right? They might, if they're confused or whatever, talk to their parent, but help them like, how could they actually give words? My dad died from cancer, or whatever the situation is. And know that if they nail you with big questions that you can't answer, like you're not failing them. I say this to parents all the time. You have done an amazing job creating a safe space where they can ask their biggest, hardest questions. And sometimes you might be able to answer. Sometimes you might have to be like, okay, I need to go find the answer. And sometimes you're like, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I wonder about that too. And we're going to wonder with them. So I'm going to just open up to questions. I know a lot has come through the chat box, and I know some people are using the Q&A as well. I'm going to take, I see one in the Q&A, and then maybe Robin, I'll just let you sort of take over whatever's coming through the chat box.
Yeah.
But someone asking, do I recommend art therapy to discuss emotions? Absolutely, and it really depends with the youth that you're supporting. It might not be like I use a lot of art with kids in creative means, but I'm not an art therapist. So I can't go as far as an art therapist could. But I'd say absolutely. Like it might not be that some kids aren't verbal processors, but through creative means or play, young kids, right? Play therapy can be very powerful as well. Having alternative ways of being able to express what's going on in their world can be very, very powerful. So absolutely, I would consider that as one of the things, to consider. And for some kids, it'll be right on, and that's what they need.
I see a question here. Some parents don't really like teachers or educators to get too personal with their kids. What are some ways to get those types of parents to work with us, by like helping their kids deal with their grief?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I know that this is an overly simplistic answer, and that, schools and educators, and it gets like magnified with young kids. You are in such difficult situations because you're often dealing with so many competing needs when there's a death in the community. But that's where I see it as one of advocacy, having, an educator or administrator who is, hopefully has a good relationship with that family is going to have more wiggle room. And be like, I'm wondering, what are some of your worries? That's usually where I'm going is like, what is their worry? If I've got a parent who's like, well, we don't want anyone talking about what's going on with their mom and stuff like that, I'd sort of ask them, like, what are some of your worries about this? Right. And sometimes they think, like, well, it'll be very upsetting for my child. And that's where we can really be like, what we know is that actually there's a lot of literature. Best practice right now is really to be honest with kids. You might even say, like, I'm not an expert in this area, and you don't need to be an expert, but like, I do know some good resources. I'm wondering, could I send you a few of those? And don't send them against 17. Send them to like kidsgrief.ca, Sesame Street, the book When Dinosaurs Die. If somebody has already died, I reserve it for that. And resource them. And so, but I would connect with them and work with the parent if you're able to around their concerns and why you're advocating for being more open with the child.
That sounds great. I had another question here too. I think you've addressed this, but maybe you could reiterate it again because maybe they didn't catch it. Um, she's asking, or the person's asking, doesn't talking about these things with younger children give them trauma in some way?
So this is very common, and I think this is like a real myth, right? And I want to be careful here because, if a child has had a traumatic experience, somebody has died, and I mean, this is a much bigger conversation because you can have like, I'll work with families. We've got three people in the same car accident. One person has trauma symptoms, two people don't. It really depends on so many things. But we don't want to ever be forcing them to talk about the thing that happened to them. Like, what did you see? What did you hear? Don't do that. But generally, talking to kids about death and dying and grief and saying, like, I'm never forcing kids to talk, I'm inviting, right? I'm wondering if you've got questions. I'm wondering if there's anything that's confusing to you. But I can promise that, like, for parents, We know the literature is very clear. Kids benefit from being included in knowing if somebody is dying in their life or if somebody has died in their life. And kids are very forgiving. I work with families all the time who they're like, listen, it was a suicide death. We didn't tell the child that. Several years have passed. We now realize, we're wishing we told the child that. And so, like, I coach them and I'm like, listen, kids tend to be very forgiving. They might be mad when you first have the conversation, and that's okay. There's the concept of rupture and repair. And you can come to them, and I would coach the family to say, this is what we talked about then. We have some more information. I'm wondering if you want it. Let them be mad if they're mad, apologize, and then say, moving forward, we're going to be really honest with you. And super clear in the literature is if we're not honest with kids, their anxiety goes up. It is scarier for them if there's not open conversations.
Right. There was someone else is asking, wondering how to work with other families who are judgmental of how or why a child's parent might have died. Example, toxic drugs, suicide, or while fighting on the other side of a war.
Beautiful question, and that's where like I would be proactive when possible. And I recognize that not all childcare centers have the ability to do what the one, that I had mentioned was like, okay, they brought me in. I'm in private practice. They had to pay me to bring me in and have these conversations and prepare the parents. But I know where I live in Guelph, the Nightingale Center, which is a terrible organization, does go into preschools, does go into schools and things like that. And there's not a fee. So you really want to figure out like what are some of the resources in my community. Is it possible that we can actually have someone come in and do some education with the parents? I think like with young kids, you want to be sort of equipping the parents as much as you can. But then I would also say there's some great resources. I didn't include them here, but I would absolutely check out the Dougie Center, how to talk to kids about suicide, how to talk about substance related deaths. Um, and typically in the families I'm working with, they're the one whose person died in the war or by suicide and I'm always like, your child's needs trump the needs of the other parents in the school who might be worried because their kid learns about suicide. They've probably already seen it in a video game or whatever else anyway. But like, and that's where there's some really good educational materials. And I would be proactive. If you can't bring someone in to do education with the family or to do a webinar, just be like, here's some tip sheets for best practice in talking about these things. And so we're sending it out to all the parents.
That's some great advice. I was looking at the time, so that's
I'm okay. So it's totally up to
okay.
you. I'm happy to just keep going
Okay.
with the questions.
I'll give you this last question then. How do you handle anticipatory grief for a child? How much do you share when you have a parent or grandparent who's facing a terminal illness?
Yeah, I mean, this really speaks to my passion as an oncology nurse that, turned grief therapist, because I saw all the time how it played out when kids weren't given the information. And really, I'm always advocating, and again, the support is there in the literature. Be honest. It doesn't mean that if you get a terminal diagnosis that day, you need to go home and talk to your kids. I always say to parents, like, give yourself a few days till you just learn that the grandparents got an illness. You can give yourself a little bit of time, gather some materials, allow yourself an emotional response and everything, but don't wait a long time before you loop the kids in. Right. And if we talk early, it might be that, okay, we know that the cancer is terminal, but our initial conversation is going to be letting the kids know that, dad has cancer. And, do you have questions about it? I find in Canada, kids in the public school system, 3, 4 years old, they've heard about Terry Fox, the word cancer, they're going to ask, most of those kids are going to ask pretty quickly, are you going to die?
Mhm.
Right. And so that's where I'm always preparing parents, like if your kid asks, this is how you can answer. For some parents, it's like, we're really hoping not. There's a bunch of treatments and things like that. But if at any point we think that, yes, I am going to die from this, we're going to let you know. But for the parent or the grandparent who is, I would be honest. If the child, like, are you going to die? Unfortunately, this cancer is probably stronger than all of the medicines we have. And so the information we have from our doctors and our healthcare team is that I probably will die from this. It doesn't mean it's tomorrow, but yes. I will. And then that's where we come back to this piece, which again is the hardest, which is bearing witness. And you just be in that. And it's okay whether I know some people said that barriers for you as educators too. Well, what if I cry? Whether you're an educator talking to a classroom and you tear up or the parents tearing up, as adults, I think it's okay to model grief, right? As long as we're not so overcome with emotion that the child has to take care of us. My coaching advice to that parent would have been tell your child right off the bat going into that conversation, this is going to be a hard conversation. But in our family, when hard stuff happens, we talk about it. And I might cry, and that's okay. And you might cry or you might not cry, and that's okay too. But you don't have to make my grief go away. And then we need to remember the same for kids. So I know there's a bunch more questions. I want this resource to be, there's a bunch of resources and you will get this all, but I really want this resource to be on people's radar because this is, two colleagues of mine and we do this in combination with Virtual Hospice. It was just yesterday, unfortunately, so it's going to be another month. It's always the first Tuesday of a month. It's literally three of us sitting on Zoom. It's the exact same format of this. And all we do is take people's questions from, I mean, really across Canada, but we've got people coming from Saudi Arabia yesterday, like all over the place, right? About how to support grieving kids. And a lot of the people who come are just learning from other people's questions. It's not confidential. I will say that, right? Because everyone's seeing the questions. So if you're asking professionally, you want to change identifying information, but it's a great free resource. There's a bunch of other resources and trainings that you'll see in the slides, but what I really want to close everybody out with is this quote by Dr. Wendy Harpin, which I really think captures the essence of, what I was hoping to share with everybody today, and that is the greatest gift you can give your children is not protection from change, loss, pain, or stress, but the confidence and tools to cope and grow with all that life has to offer them. Right? And that really speaks to the power of bearing witness and teaching kids that we can be with these hard thoughts and hard feelings and we can survive them. Right? But also that reframe I'm also doing with families that actually, withholding information from your child, that's not protection, right? That's creating big informational gaps for them and we're leaving it up to their imaginations. And you all know as well as anybody, better than anybody really, what kids' imaginations can come up with when they don't have the answers. But in fact, the best protection for them is to prepare them. And I actually find for a lot of families who initially might be hesitant to enter those conversations, it's a bit of an aha. Like a lot of people get it pretty quickly and they're like, yeah, that actually makes sense. So thank you everybody for being here and for your questions. And please, whether you can come to Kids Grief Q&A or not, you're always allowed to forward questions in beforehand as well. And we'll answer them. It's recorded. It's available for a month after that as well. So please take good care of yourselves. And thank you for being here and the advocacy and support that you're providing so many kids right across this country. And a big thanks to Robin and Suzanne for inviting me to be here with you all.
Oh, it was wonderful. It's such great information. It's so empowering. And I think, really fine-tuning those elements of respect and honesty and inclusion, I think are so key for this. And I think it's just something that people have a lot of difficulty when they think about dealing with it. But then when the time comes, sometimes your natural instincts can take over and they're the right things to do. And I think that's what you've empowered us with tonight, which is just so valuable. And I mean, I was recalling even just recently when my own mother passed away and my son just went and sat beside her and she was in long-term care and held her hand. And
Yeah.
I actually wasn't able to do that, honestly. It was just too hard for me, but I thought I'm not going to stop him because that's what he needed to do in that moment. And it really was a moment for him. That's what he just walked right in and did that. So I thought,
Oh wow, I've got goosebumps just listening
yeah.
to that.
So I thought,
Yeah.
yeah, like I thought, and I was about to say something. I'm like, no, actually, you have to let them run their journey too. And I think that's respecting that and looking at that within another person, what their grief journey is like. It's fascinating. And certainly this information I know will go a long way in helping people deal with this in a much better manner than feeling overwhelmed as they probably are now, and trusting their instincts. So thank you so much. And we're really excited to be sharing this information with everybody with the slides and that great tip about the kids' grief Q&A, which will be a wonderful opportunity for people as well. Because I know some people had some kind of deeper questions that were kind of hard to get into tonight. So maybe something like that would be a better opportunity and a better platform for them. And just remind everybody that their certificates will be sent sent out within 48 hours, and we'll have this posted to our YouTube channel, the Canadian Child Care Federation's YouTube channel, within 48 hours. And the resources will be sent out this week as well. So all that will happen by Friday. So just give us a little time to get all that out to all of you. And thank you for joining us because I realize this is your evening too, and I appreciate that you thought this is an important enough topic to join us and learn more about. So thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much. And people have suggested we have a part two, so we might have to get back to you for a part two.
I'm always up for part two, Robin, so you know where to find me.
We love the part twos. Okay, well, we'll be in touch, and thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.